All right, picture this for a second. It's the spring of 1922. We're in a quiet, incredibly isolated corner of rural Bavaria. A 63-year-old farmer named Andreas Gruber walks out to the very edge of his property. The air is freezing cold, and he just stands there for a long time, staring down at the snow. Because there, pressing into the fresh powder, are footprints. And what Andreas Gruber was looking at that day was actually the beginning of one of the most chilling, atmospheric mysteries we have on record. He's looking at a single set of footprints, leading right out of the dark, dense line of the forest, straight across the open field, and directly to the door of his farmhouse. But here is the absolutely terrifying reality of this situation. There were no prints leading back. Think about that. Whoever walked out of those trees the night before had not returned to the woods. They were still somewhere on the property. And within 6 days of him making this discovery, all 6 residents of that farm would be dead. To understand how something this horrific could go completely unnoticed, we need to look at our first section, the isolated Gruber family. So the farm itself was called Hinterkaifeck. And when I say isolated, I mean it sat completely alone at the absolute end of a dirt track through the trees, just surrounded by open fields between Ingolstadt and Munich. Now, you have to remember, Germany in 1922 was completely broken, economically, politically, emotionally, by the First World War. It was the time when people really just kept their heads down and tried not to attract attention. Plus, the head of this farm, Andreas Gruber, was already a pretty unpopular guy. He was known around the local village as being incredibly miserly, deeply suspicious, quick to anger, and physically violent with the women in his house. Honestly, it was the kind of place where you could scream and literally no one would ever hear you. So who actually lived under that roof? Well, you had 6 people. There was Andreas and his 72-year-old wife, Kazilia. Living with them was their 35-year-old daughter, Victoria. Her husband, Karl, was actually officially killed on the Western Front back in 1914. She had 2 kids, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Now, there were some incredibly dark, unsettling local rumors going around regarding exactly who had fathered little Joseph. And those rumors weren't pointing to anyone outside the family, but rather inside it. But true or not, the Grubers just did not socialize. They locked their doors tight every single night. But as you'll see, locked doors couldn't keep out what was coming. Let's move to the next section, footsteps in the attic. The sheer dread of this case actually escalated over several months. This wasn't a sudden attack. Back in autumn of 1921, their maid abruptly quits, just packs up and flees, telling the village that the farm is haunted by footsteps and voices in empty rooms. Fast forward a bit to March 1922. Andreas finds a newspaper sitting in his house that absolutely no one bought. Soon after that, his house key goes missing from its usual spot. Late March rolls around and he starts hearing footsteps up in the attic at night. But when he goes up to check, he finds nothing. Though to be fair, the attic did have 2 entrances, so someone could have easily slipped away. And finally, on March 30th, he finds those footprints in the snow. Now, Andreas actually told several people in the village about all of this. He told the local priest, a neighbor, a mechanic, but shockingly, neither he nor any of them actually went to the police. Which brings us to Friday, March 31st. Talk about the worst possible timing. A 44-year-old woman named Maria Baumgartner arrives at the farm. She'd been hired as the new maid a few weeks earlier. Her sister actually helped carry her things inside and then took off in the late afternoon. Maria was at Hinterkaifeck for just a few hours, because by that evening, she would be dead. So what really went down in the dark on March 31st? Let's get into it in this next section, the night of the murders. We have to rely on the grim reconstruction pieced together by investigators days later, but the attacks were horrifyingly systematic. The widely accepted theory is that one by one, the 4 older members of the family, Victoria, young 7-year-old Kazilia, and the 2 grandparents, were lured out into the barn, which was connected to the main house by a short little passage. They likely heard a noise, maybe thought an animal was in trouble, so they walk out into the pitch black, totally expecting to find one of their horses or cows. But instead, they found someone waiting for them in the dark. And the killer was armed with a mattock. Now, if you're not familiar, a mattock isn't designed to be a weapon. It's a heavy farming tool, used for breaking up hard ground. But in the hands of someone incredibly strong, with the broad side turned outward, it is absolutely devastating. The killer struck down the 4 family members one by one. And then, in a bizarre twist, they laid the bodies out really carefully, almost neatly stacking them on top of one another, before covering the whole pile with hay in an old wooden door. From there, the geography of the crime shifts, and there's a really chilling progression. After murdering those 4 people in the barn, the killer moves directly into the farmhouse itself. They didn't even try to lure the remaining 2 out. 2-year-old Josef was murdered right inside his cot. Maria Baumgartner, the newly arrived maid who had literally just unpacked her bags, was killed right in her bed. Both of them killed exactly where they lay. 6 lives violently extinguished inside their own home in a single evening. Just take a second to let that number sink in, because honestly, it's what happens after these 6 murders that elevates this from a tragic rural crime into an absolute enduring nightmare. 4. The killers stayed on the farm with those 6 bodies for at least 4 days. Let that sink in. Whoever did this didn't just strike and flee into the night. No, over the next 4 days, they stayed. They fed the farm animals. They casually ate food right out of the Gribber's kitchen. Neighbors even reported seeing smoke casually rising from the farmhouse chimney over the weekend and had absolutely no reason to suspect anything was out of the ordinary. It wasn't until Tuesday, April 4th, that concern finally broke through all that isolation. Let's look at suspects and the investigation. By Tuesday, people started to notice things. Little Kazilia hadn't been at school. The postman noticed the mail was just piling up. Eventually, a group of neighbors decided to walk up that dirt track to check on the family. They get there, find the door unlocked, and a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer is the one who actually finds the bodies in the barn. But, and this is crucial, witnesses noted something deeply weird about him. Schlittenbauer seemed to know exactly where to look. While the other men were way too shaken up to even enter the barn, he just walked right up, pulled the old door and the hay off the pile of bodies all by himself, using his bare hands. What followed was, quite frankly, an investigative disaster. Crime scene preservation in 1922 rural Bavaria was essentially non-existent. By the time the Munich police finally arrived the next morning, the entire scene had been trampled by dozens of curious villagers. Any forensic evidence that could have identified the killer was completely destroyed within hours. What happened next was an 80-year investigation where over 100 suspects were questioned, and in a really grim historical footnote, the severed heads of all 6 victims were actually sent to Munich to be examined by forensic experts and even clairvoyants, only to be entirely lost when Munich was bombed during the Second World War. They were never recovered, and the case was officially closed in 1955. So who was actually on the radar? Investigators focused on a few primary theories. First up, obviously, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who found the bodies. He had once formally claimed to be the father of little Josef before suddenly withdrawing the claim. He knew the farm inside out, definitely had a reason to enter the barn, and moved way too calmly through the crime scene. He was questioned multiple times over the years, but aggressively sued his accusers for slander and died in 1941 without ever being charged. Then you have Karl and Andreas Gump. These were brothers and known criminals who were arrested decades later. They made some ambiguous statements, but honestly, the evidence was just way too thin. And finally, there's the theory of the unknown drifter, some phantom passing through a broken post-war country who stumbled on the most isolated farm around, hid in the attic for days, executed the family, and just vanished back into history without leaving so much as a name. But here is a truly wild twist. The investigation didn't actually end in the 1950s. Fast forward to 2007, and a German police academy quietly reopened the case as a modern training exercise. Using 21st century investigative techniques, the cadets reviewed all the old evidence and, amazingly, they actually came to a conclusion. They identified the suspect they considered to be the absolute most likely killer. But, and this is almost unbelievable, out of respect for the suspect's living descendants, they refused to release the name publicly. And so, a century later, we arrive at our final section, an unsolved Bavarian mystery. Before we wrap up this explainer, there is one final, lingering detail that never, ever stops bothering me when I look at this case. In the days right before the murders, when Andreas Gruber was complaining to neighbors about those missing keys, he shared one more little detail. He said that as he lay in bed, in the absolute pitch dark of that isolated farmhouse, he heard something very distinct coming from the ceiling right above his head. The sound of someone breathing, quietly. Evenly. Just waiting. He didn't call the police, he didn't pack his family up and run, he simply closed his eyes and went to sleep, while the killer waited just a few boards away for the new maid to arrive. Which leaves us staring right back at where we started. Over a century later, the farmhouse itself is totally gone, replaced by just an empty field and a small wooden memorial cross. but the silence is still there. So I'll ask you, who walked out of the forest that winter night and never walked back? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning what's hiding in the dark.